My husband looked me in the eye and asked me to share our bed with his girlfriend. Then he called me old-fashioned for saying no. My name is Anna Young. 6 years ago, I married a man named Jude Hall. 3 nights ago, in the bedroom of the house we bought together outside Dallas, Jude told me about a woman named Leah Henderson. He'd been seeing her for 8 months, and he wanted her in our marriage, in our bed. He wanted me to be fine with it. I need to back up first so you understand why that sentence hit the way it did. My grandfather, Henry Young, started this company with 1 truck in 1965. He drove routes himself for the first 3 years, slept in the cab more nights than he slept in a bed, and built Young Freight Lines into one of the largest regional carriers in Texas. My father ran it after him, but my father wasn't a builder, he was a manager, competent, forgettable. It was my grandfather who taught me the business. I rode with him on Saturday mornings when I was 8 years old, sitting in the passenger seat of a truck older than my mother, listening to him explain manifests and margins like they were bedtime stories. Before he died, my grandfather did something my father never fully understood. He restructured the ownership. He made sure that no matter who I married, no matter who sat on the board, 51% of Young Freight Lines would always belong to a Young by blood, not by marriage, not by title, blood. He told me once in that truck, "Anna, people will try to sit in the front seat because it looks good from the outside. You make sure they never forget whose name is on the door." I married Jude 2 years after my grandfather died. I gave Jude a board seat myself 3 years into the marriage because I loved him and because he was sharp on logistics contracts, and I thought a husband and wife building something together was the whole point of getting married in the first place. That's the man who stood in our bedroom on a Tuesday night, drink in his hand, and told me not to be so old-fashioned. I didn't yell. I want to be honest about that, because I know what people expect from a moment like this. A scene, tears, something thrown. None of that happened. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I looked at my hands, and I said, "I see." Jude kept talking. He said Leah understood the situation. He said this could be good for everyone. He said the word modern like it was a gift he was handing me. I got into bed. I turned off the lamp. He asked if we could talk about it like adults. I didn't answer him. He fell asleep in under 20 minutes because that's the kind of man Jude is. Nothing sits on his conscience long enough to keep him awake. I didn't sleep at all. I lay there and I thought about my grandfather's hands on a steering wheel. I thought about the paperwork he signed 11 years ago, sitting at his kitchen table with our family attorney, the year before the cancer took him. And somewhere around 4 in the morning, I stopped feeling like a woman whose husband had humiliated her, and I started feeling like the majority shareholder of a company Jude Hall had forgotten he only worked for. At 5:04 a.m., I got up, made coffee, and called my attorney, Isabel Burns, before the sun was even up. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Isabel, I need to call an emergency board session." She asked when. I said 2 days. There was a pause on the line, a long one for Isabel, who never pauses. Then she said, "Under what provision?" And I told her exactly which one, the one my grandfather wrote into the bylaws himself, the one that says the majority shareholder can remove a board member with 48 hours notice, no explanation required. Isabel said, "You want to remove Jude." I said, "I want the paperwork on every board member's desk by 9 this morning." What I didn't tell her yet, what I hadn't even fully admitted to myself, was that Jude had no idea any of this was coming. He was going to walk into that boardroom Thursday morning in his good suit, thinking he still had a chair waiting for him. He didn't know that by Thursday morning, that chair wasn't going to belong to anyone named Hall. If you want to see what happens when Jude finds out, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every one, and it tells me whether I should keep going with this story.
I didn't go home Tuesday night. I sat in my car in the parking garage under our building for almost 20 minutes before I even turned the key. I kept thinking about driving back to that house, walking past the bedroom door, seeing Jude asleep like nothing had happened. I couldn't do it, so I drove to the office instead, took the elevator to the 9th floor and sat down at my desk at 11:40 at night in the building my grandfather bought in 1978 with cash he'd saved for 11 straight years, one truck payment at a time. I slept maybe 2 hours on the couch in my own office. I woke up at 6 with a stiff neck and a phone full of nothing from Jude. Not one text, not one call. That told me something too. He wasn't worried yet. He still thought this was going to blow over the way everything always blew over between us. The first call I made that morning was to my sister, Lily West. Lily is 24. She's been working under me in operations for a year and a half, still learning the business, still mostly sitting quietly in meetings and taking notes. But she's sharp in a way people underestimate, and she's the only person left in this family besides me who still calls our grandfather Pop instead of Mr. Young. She picked up on the second ring, half asleep. I said, "Lily, I need you at a board meeting Thursday morning, 9 sharp." She asked, "What board meeting?" I told her I'd called an emergency session. There was a pause. Then she asked, careful, like she already knew this wasn't good news, "Is this about Jude?" I said yes. I gave her 3 sentences. Jude, another woman named Leah, a proposal I wasn't going to dignify with more detail than that. Lily went quiet for a second. Then she said something that knocked the wind out of me a little. She said, "Good, it's about time somebody did something about him." I asked her what she meant by that. She told me she'd seen Jude at a restaurant on Preston Road almost 2 months earlier, sitting across from a woman who wasn't me, close enough that it wasn't a business lunch. She hadn't said anything because she didn't have proof, and because she didn't want to be the sister who blew up my marriage over something that might have had an explanation. It hadn't had an explanation, not one that mattered anyway. After I hung up with Lily, I called my cousin, Logan Lawson. Logan runs operations for the company, and he's one of only 2 people on that board who was there before I ever gave Jude a seat. I told him the same 3 sentences I'd given Lily. Logan didn't ask a single follow-up question. He just said, "What do you need from me Thursday?" I said, "I need you in the room. I need you voting yes." He said, "Anna, you didn't need to ask me that." By Wednesday afternoon, I was sitting across from my attorney, Isabel Burns, in her office downtown, watching her finalize the resolution on her laptop. 1 page, clean language, my grandfather's provisions cited by section number, the same section he'd had written into the bylaws back in 1987, long before anyone in this family had ever heard the name Jude Hall. Isabel turned the laptop toward me so I could read it myself before it went out. Then she sat back and asked me the same question Logan hadn't needed to ask. "Are you sure about this, Anna? Once this goes out to the full board, there's no quiet way to undo it." I told her I'd been sure since 4 in the morning the night before, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee. What none of us accounted for was Jude's assistant, Lexi Griffiths. Board notices go out to every member the same way by policy, the moment they're finalized. Isabel's office sent it Wednesday morning at 9 sharp. It was supposed to land in Jude's inbox the way most of his corporate mail did, unread, buried, ignored until someone reminded it existed. Instead, Wednesday night at a little after 9, my phone rang, Jude's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer. I did anyway. He said, "Anna, why did Lexi just hand me a notice about an emergency board session tomorrow morning?" My stomach dropped straight through the floor. Someone actually put that notice directly in his hands. I didn't say anything right away.
He said my name again, harder this time. Anna, what is this? I looked down at the resolution sitting on the desk in front of me, my grandfather's words typed out in plain black letters, and I gave him the only answer I had left to give. You'll find out tomorrow at 9. I hung up before he could say another word, and for the first time since Tuesday night, my hands started shaking again, because now he knew something was coming for him, and I had no idea what a man like Jude would do with the hours he had left before that door closed on him for good.
Jude showed up at 8:50 the next morning in his charcoal suit, the one he only wears when he wants to walk into a room looking like he's already won whatever's about to happen in it. I watched him come through the glass doors from where I was sitting, already at the head of the table, in the chair that used to be his. Isabel met him in the hallway before he even reached the boardroom. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw his face change. She was asking him to wait in the small conference room next door instead. He looked past her shoulder through the glass wall and saw me sitting there. I watched him work it out in real time, the confusion first, then something colder underneath it, the beginning of a calculation. He didn't say anything to me, he just followed Isabel into the side room and the door clicked shut behind him. I looked around the table at the people who were about to decide this with me. Logan Lawson sat to my left, arms folded, jaw set. Rudy Dodson sat further down, 71 years old, on this board since before I was born, hands folded on the table like he already knew exactly how the next 10 minutes were going to go. Matthew Gardner sat across from him, the kind of quiet that comes from a man who watches everything and says nothing until he's ready. And in the corner of the room, exactly where I'd asked her to sit, close enough to see everything, far enough that she wasn't part of the vote, was Lily. Isabel came back in without Jude and handed out copies of the resolution, 1 page each. I read it out loud myself because I wanted it to be my voice in the room when it happened, not just words on paper. The board seat currently held by Jude Allen Hall is hereby vacated, effective immediately, pursuant to Article 7, Section 3 of the Corporate Bylaws, by direction of the majority shareholder. I looked up when I finished. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Rudy Dodson was the one who spoke first. He said, "Anna, I've sat on this board for over 40 years. I watched your grandfather write that provision himself, and I always figured he wrote it hoping he'd never need it. He looked at me steady, not unkind, just direct. Is this the day we need it?" I said, "This is the day." Rudy nodded once, like that was the only answer he needed. Isabel called the vote. 6 yes, 0 no. Done, just like that, in less time than it takes to order coffee. Isabel stood and went to get Jude. He walked back in, still holding the envelope she must have handed him earlier, unopened. He looked at his old chair, empty now except for a plain chair pulled up in its place. Nothing special about it, nothing that said it used to belong to anyone in particular. Then he looked at me, sitting where he used to sit, and something in his face hardened. He said, "Anna, what is going on?" I told him plainly. Board seat vacated. Bylaws, Article 7, Section 3. Majority shareholder authority. Effective immediately. He said, "You're doing this over Leah." I said, "I'm doing this because you stood in our bedroom and asked me to accept your girlfriend into our marriage like you were pitching me a business deal. I'm doing this because you forgot somewhere along the way that I gave you that chair. I didn't inherit you into it. I chose to put you there." He looked around the table at Logan, at Rudy, at Matthew, searching for one face that might side with him. Nobody did. Nobody even looked uncomfortable for him. That's when Jude said something that changed the temperature of the entire room. He said, "You want to talk about what people forget, Anna? Fine. Let's talk about the Meridian contract. Let's talk about what I know about how that deal actually got signed." The room went still in a different way than before. Not the stillness of a decision already made, but the stillness of people suddenly unsure what was coming next. I saw Rudy's expression shift. I saw Logan sit up a little straighter in his chair. I knew exactly what Jude was talking about, and I knew in that instant that he'd been saving it, not as a defense, but as a weapon,
waiting for the exact moment it would do the most damage in front of the most people.
The Meridian contract was the largest freight deal Young Freight Lines had ever signed. $14 million over 5 years, with one of the biggest regional distributors in the Southwest. I closed that deal myself, 18 months earlier, sitting across a conference table in Houston for 11 straight hours, until both sides finally shook hands. Jude had been in the room for parts of that negotiation, not all of it, but enough. Here's what he knew. In the final stretch of that deal, to keep Meridian from walking, I agreed to a set of adjusted delivery penalty terms that weren't run through full board review first. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even unusual for a deal moving that fast, that close to the deadline. I had the authority as CEO to make that call, and I made it. But it was the kind of detail I never wanted printed in a public filing or repeated in front of a room that didn't already understand the full context. And Jude knew exactly how it would sound if he said it out loud to people who didn't have that context. He said it again, slower this time, making sure every word landed. I still have the side letter, Anna. I still have the emails. You want to throw me off this board in front of everyone sitting here? Let's see how they feel about how that deal really got done. Rudy Dodson looked at me, not with suspicion exactly, more like the patience of a man who'd sat through 40 years of boardroom bluffs and knew the difference between a real threat and a desperate one. He said, "Anna, is there something about the Meridian deal this board needs to know?" I didn't flinch. Flinching was exactly what Jude wanted from me in that moment. I said, "The concession terms were disclosed to legal counsel and structured within my authority as CEO. If the board wants a full accounting of the Meridian contract, I'll have Isabel prepare a complete report for the next quarterly meeting. That's a separate matter from what we're voting on today, and Jude knows it. He's bringing it up right now because it's the only card he has left to play, and it isn't half as strong as he thinks it is." Isabel backed me immediately, no hesitation in her voice. She confirmed the concessions had been within my authority as CEO and properly documented with legal, even if they hadn't been circulated to the full board at the time. Every word of it was true. It also bought me exactly the room I needed in that moment. Jude realized the card wasn't landing the way he'd hoped. He looked to Logan for something, anything. Logan just looked back at him, flat and unmoved, and said, "You're not going to find an ally at this table. Jude, sit down or leave." Jude stood there a few seconds longer, the envelope Isabel had given him earlier still unopened in his hand. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the boardroom. I thought that was the end of it for the day. I was wrong. That evening, my phone rang. It was Lily, and her voice had an edge to it I hadn't heard from her before. She told me Jude had driven straight from the office to Leah Henderson's apartment. She'd seen his car parked outside when she drove past. 2 hours after that, Leah had posted something online, a long message on her personal page, not naming the company outright, but naming enough that anyone who knew our industry, our family, our board, would know exactly which contract, which company, which family she was talking about. Lily started reading me the first line before I stopped her. It said Leah had information about how Young Freight really does business behind closed doors. I sat in my driveway that night with the engine off, staring at my own front door, and understood that Jude wasn't finished. He'd just changed weapons, from a boardroom threat to something public, something that could reach clients, reach the press, reach people who had no idea what the real story even was. I had maybe 12 hours before that post spread far enough to matter, and I had no idea yet whether stopping it would cost me more than the board seat I'd just taken back.
I didn't call Isabel that night. It was almost 11 and I needed someone who wouldn't panic with me, so I called Rudy Dodson instead. He'd sat on this board since before I could read a balance sheet. If anyone had seen worse than an angry ex-girlfriend's post online, it was him. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then he asked one question. Anna, has anything in that side letter ever actually broken a law, violated a contract term, or hurt a client? I told him no. Every concession was legal, disclosed to Meridian's own counsel at the time, and fully within my authority as CEO. He said, "Then what you've got is an embarrassment, not a crime. Embarrassments pass if you don't feed them. Let Isabel handle it as a legal matter in the morning. Don't respond tonight. Don't give it anywhere to grow." I took his advice, even though every instinct in me wanted to fix it immediately. I didn't sleep much again that night, but I didn't touch my phone either. Isabel sent a cease and desist to Leah Henderson first thing the next morning, citing the confidentiality obligations Jude was still legally bound by as a former board member, obligations that extended to information he shared with anyone else, including her. The post came down within 6 hours. Leah had never worked in freight logistics and had never signed anything herself, but Jude had, years earlier, and that letter reminded him exactly how much he still stood to lose if this turned from a divorce into a lawsuit. Jude filed for divorce 3 weeks later. I didn't contest a single part of it. Isabel structured the settlement the same way my grandfather had structured everything else in this family: fair, fully documented, and nowhere close to touching the 51% that was never his to take in the first place. The Meridian matter went in front of the full board the following quarter, exactly as I'd promised the day Jude tried to use it against me. Isabel walked them through the complete accounting. Rudy asked 2 sharp questions. Matthew asked 1 more. Then they approved the report unanimously and moved on to the next item on the agenda, because, in the end, there had never really been anything for Jude to use, only something he was counting on me being too afraid to explain out loud in front of people who mattered. He'd bet on my silence. He lost that bet the moment I decided I wasn't going to be quiet about any of it anymore. 6 months after the divorce was final, I brought Lily onto the board as a full voting member. Logan Lawson took over as president of operations, and I kept my seat at the head of that table, the one with my grandfather's initials carved quietly into the underside of the armrest, a detail almost nobody in that boardroom even knew was there, because he'd asked the furniture maker to do it back in 1979 and never told a soul why. One Saturday that spring, I drove Lily out to the old lot in South Dallas, where my grandfather kept his very first truck back in 1965. It's just a storage yard now, rented out to some other company, but the frame of the original garage is still standing at the back of the property, rusted and half collapsed, nobody bothering to tear it down. Lily stood there looking at it for a long time. Then she asked me, "Did Pop know, when he wrote that 51% rule, did he know it would end up mattering exactly like this?" I told her the truth. He didn't know about Jude, he didn't know about Leah, or the Meridian contract, or any of the specific ways it would come apart. He just knew, somewhere in his bones, that someday somebody was going to sit across from a Young at that cable and forget whose name was actually on the building. He made sure whoever it was, they'd be the one who had to get up and leave the room in the end, not us. We stood there a while longer in the quiet, looking at what was left of where all of this started: 1 truck, 1 man, and a promise he kept long after he was gone. Then we got back in the car and drove home, because Monday morning meant another board meeting and there was still a company to run.